Hey, Tom,
Yeah?
I've just been looking through your YouTube channel and I was wondering if you were open to some critical feedback.
Go on.
Well, I can't help but notice that your content's become really negative recently. You either make videos about how much you hate the art world, or you make videos about toxic white male artists.
Oh yeah, hadn't really noticed.
I was thinking maybe you could make a video about an artist you actually like, an artist that's worthy of celebrating, and maybe not another white man.
An artist I actually like, who's not a white man. I think I know what to do.
Hello, and welcome back to Art Theoriez. Today we're going to be talking about a titan of 20th century painting, Frida Kahlo. I don't think anyone can truly understand 20th century art history without understanding her influence. So this week we're doing a deep dive into the art and life of Frida Kahlo. I was really excited to make this video because I genuinely love her work and her life story is just really interesting. But before we get into the video, I just want to do some housekeeping. This video is mainly focused on the art and the life of Frida Kahlo, but Frida Kahlo's law intertwines with the law of the great Mexican muralist, Diego Rivera. So this video will also be talking in some detail about Diego Rivera. Today's video is a bit longer than my usual videos, so you could watch it in one go, or you could consider watching it in parts, whatever suits you best. And finally, before we get into it, I put my heart and soul into this video, so please like and subscribe. And if you can afford to, please consider supporting me via Patreon. For $5 a month or £4.50, you can help me to continue making art educational content online that anyone can access for free. The link to my Patreon is in the video description. Without further ado, let's get into the law of Frida Kahlo. Chapter 1. Frida Kahlo's origin story. Frida Kahlo was born in 1907 in Coyoacán, southwest Mexico City. Her father was Guillermo Kahlo, a German Jewish immigrant who arrived in Mexico with no money, but eventually became a successful photographer. He's best known for photographing Mexico's architecture, both old and new. Frida's mother was Matilde Calderon. She had mixed native and Spanish heritage. She was very Catholic and she was also very photogenic. Frida grew up in her family home, the Casa Azul, which after her death was converted into the Frida Kahlo Museum. Frida was a very playful and imaginative child, and she was very social. When she was on her own, she would play with imaginary friends. At school, she could be quite defiant and very naughty. She loved animals, and she had a strong sense of justice. When Frida was 6 years old, she was stricken with polio, and she spent 9 months in bed with horrible pains in her right leg. During these 9 months, Frida felt very lonely and she really missed playing with the other children. When Frida was a bit older, her dad shared with her his interest in photography and Mexican archaeology. From then on, Frida would accompany her dad on photography outings and be his assistant. From 1910 to 1920, the Mexican Revolution took place. Frida was very proud of the fact that her childhood took place during Mexico's revolutionary decade. And Frida claimed to remember certain revolutionary battles that took place in Mexico City. But that seems unlikely, as she would have been very young, and she was known to stretch the truth a little. Before the Mexican Revolution, the dictator of Mexico had looked abroad, to Europe and the USA, for examples of high culture, and Mexico's indigenous culture was looked down upon by the political establishment. Mexico's dictator, Porfirio Diaz, used to powder his skin to appear more white. But after the revolution, and throughout the 1920s, Mexicans were rejecting European ideals and were beginning to re-embrace their own native culture and identity. And this was all happening around Frida while she was coming of age. As part of this re-embracing of Mexican culture, the new Mexican government contracted artists to decorate Mexico's walls with murals that would glorify Mexico's history and culture and that would inspire social change. And in 1922, Mexico's most famous muralist, Diego Rivera, was commissioned to paint a mural at the National Preparatory School, where Frida Kahlo was a student. Diego was 36 years old, overweight and very charismatic. Some students would joke that he looked like a frog. Frida was quite a naughty child, and on one occasion she stole food out of Rivera's lunch basket. On another occasion, she poured soap all over the stairwell where Diego was working and hid round the corner to watch him fall over. Fortunately for Rivera, he saw the soap and walked carefully down the stairs without falling. A different professor, however, did fall down the stairs. Young Frida became kind of infatuated with Diego. She would watch him paint for hours, and sometimes she would heckle him as he was painting. She even told a friend that she wanted to have his babies. My guess is that her pranks were a way of trying to get Diego's attention. Luckily, nothing happened between Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera for a few more years. On September the 17th, 1925, when Frida was 18 years old, something terrible would happen that would change her life forever. Frida and her boyfriend, Alejandro, were travelling across Mexico City by bus. Buses were new to Mexico City, and bus drivers were notorious for their reckless driving, and accidents were very common. The bus was turning a corner when it was hit by a trolley. The trolley was moving slowly, but it didn't stop. It was as if the trolley didn't have brakes. As the trolley continued to ram into the bus bent as it hit the corner of the building. And in that bending process, a piece of handrail pierced into Frida and went all the way through her pelvis. Reflecting on her accident, Frida said, "It was a strange collision. It was not violent, but rather silent, slow, and it harmed everyone." Her spinal column was broken in 3 places. Her collarbone and 2 ribs were broken. Her right leg was fractured, her right foot was crushed, her left shoulder was out of its joint, and her pelvis was broken in 3 places. The doctors didn't think they'd be able to save Frida Kahlo, and they thought she'd die on the operating table. Luckily, Frida did survive, but from that day on, pain and illness would become central themes in Frida's art and life. Chapter 2. Becoming an Artist. 1926 was a bad year for Frida Kahlo. She was stuck at home, she could barely move, she had constant pain and fatigue, and things weren't great between her and her boyfriend. It was during this incredibly difficult time in her life that she first turned to painting. Frida's dad had some oil paints lying around the house. Frida was bored at home, so she decided to try her hand at painting. Reflecting on this time in her life, Frida said the following: "I never thought of painting until 1926, when I was in bed on account of an automobile accident. I was bored as hell, in bed with a plaster cast, so I decided to do something. I stole from my father some oil paints, and my mother ordered me a special easel because I couldn't sit up." Frida's first subjects were portraits of her friends. Unfortunately, most of these paintings no longer exist. Apparently, Frida thought one of her paintings was so bad she destroyed it. Frida painted her first self-portrait in 1926. In this painting, we can see a strong European influence, specifically the influence of Botticelli and Art Nouveau. But Frida would soon shake off this European aesthetic. By 1927, Frida had recovered enough to live an almost normal life. Before the accident, Frida had wanted to study to become a doctor, but after her accident and recovery, she decided not to return to school and to commit herself to painting instead. It was during this period that Frida first became politically engaged. In 1928, the president, Álvaro Obregón, was murdered, and new elections were called for in 1929. It was a very politically turbulent time. Alongside this, there were mass protests for university autonomy, and in 1929, a national student strike took place. Frida happened to be friends with one of the leaders of the student protests, named Germain de Campo. De Campo introduced Frida to his other communist friends, including a couple of Cuban revolutionaries and the Italian photographer Tina Modotti. Frida and Tina Modotti soon became close friends. Frida was entering a new world of communists and bohemian artists, and this wasn't a world Frida Kahlo's boyfriend Alejandro wanted anything to do with. So in 1928, they broke up. Through her friendship with Tina Modotti, Frida joined the Communist Party and was reintroduced to Diego Rivera, who was Mexico's most famous muralist and a communist. When Frida met Diego for the second time, she was 21 and he was 41. Frida met Diego at a party at Tina Modotti's house, but soon afterwards, Frida went to the scaffolding where Diego was painting and brought a sample of her paintings. She asked Diego to come down and take a look. Diego came down off the scaffolding, took a look at Frida's paintings, told her she was very talented, and told her that she must keep painting. Frida asked Diego if he could come to her house on Sunday to take a look at some more of her paintings. Diego agreed. He came over on the Sunday to take a look at more of her paintings. And let's just say that's not the only thing they did that Sunday. For the next couple of months, Frida would visit Diego at his scaffolding and watch him paint, and Diego would visit Frida's home under the pretense of looking at her paintings. Frida even modelled for Diego, and it wasn't long before Diego asked Frida to marry him. Diego reflected, although I was twice her age, no one felt the least bit awkward. Her family too seemed to accept what was going on. I personally think Frida did actually love Diego, but it certainly helped that Diego was rich and he could financially take care not only of Frida but of her family too. But despite Diego's money, Frida's mum still did have a bit of an issue with Diego's marriage proposal, mainly because Diego was a communist, an atheist, and twice Frida's age. And Frida's mum was a trad Catholic. But despite her protests, on the 21st of August 1929, the marriage went ahead. Around this time, Frida painted her second self-portrait. As you can see, this self-portrait feels a little bit less European. Gone is the Botticelli neck, the Art Nouveau curves, and her skin is less pale. To me, this painting feels a bit less pretentious. In 1929, shortly after their wedding, Diego Rivera was thrown out of the Communist Party. He was thrown out for two reasons. Firstly, because he was friends with certain government officials, and secondly, because he had accepted a commission to paint a mural for the National Palace, which the communists believed helped the government to look progressive in the public eye. Diego still believed in communism, and Marxist ideals were still at the core of his painting, but he was no longer a member of the Communist Party. Frida also left the Communist Party in solidarity with Diego when he was expelled. Frida had always wanted to have children, and shortly after their marriage, she became pregnant. However, after 3 months, Frida had to abort the pregnancy because the fetus was in the wrong position. This devastated Frida, and Frida's sadness was increased further when she discovered that Diego had been having an affair with one of his assistants. This is less than a year after they got married. Reflecting on Diego's affair, Frida said, "I suffered 2 great accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other accident was Diego." Chapter 3. Adventures in the USA. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, anti-communist hysteria was sweeping Mexico. A fascist organisation called the Gold Shirts were causing trouble, and mural production had been suspended by presidential decree. These conditions were not ideal for Diego Rivera, who was clearly painting Marxist visions of Mexico. Thing is, Diego had international fame, and he was being offered commissions to paint murals in the United States. So in November 1930, when he was offered a commission to paint a mural at the San Francisco Stock Exchange, him and Frida upped sticks and moved to San Francisco. For the San Francisco Stock Exchange, Diego decided to paint an allegory of California, but he was in no rush. He didn't even start the painting until about 2 months after arriving in San Francisco, which meant Frida had some time on her hands. During her stay in San Francisco, Frida was very productive. She painted a portrait of her new friend and medical advisor, Dr. Eloisa. She painted a portrait of the famous horticulturalist, Luther Burbank, and she painted this portrait of herself and Diego. In this painting, Diego is cast as the heroic artist, and she's depicted as the adoring wife at his side. Diego turns his head slightly away from Frida. Some people speculate that this represents Frida's fear that Diego would continue to be unfaithful. During their stay in San Francisco, Diego also completed a mural for the California School of Fine Art called The Making of a Fresco, in which he painted himself and his assistants painting a mural. Very meta. At the centre of this mural sits Diego, with his back turned to the viewers and his butt protruding outwards. Many locals chose to take offence at this, seeing it as a direct insult to the San Franciscans who had hosted him. Then, in June 1931, Diego was summoned back to Mexico by presidential decree to complete the mural he'd left unfinished at the National Palace. Once they got back to Mexico, they started building their new home in the San Angel region of Mexico City. The house was actually 2 separate houses linked by a bridge. Diego would live in the bigger one and Frida in the smaller blue house. But Frida and Diego were not in Mexico for long, because in July of 1931, Diego was invited to have a retrospective exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Diego had a big ego, and there was no way he was turning down a retrospective exhibition at MoMA, so off they went. It was an exciting time to be at the centre of New York's art scene. As New York's cultural influence began to grow, it began to challenge the dominance of Paris as the cultural epicentre of the world. Upon arriving in New York City, Diego told a reporter, "There is no reason in the world why any person born on our two continents should go to Europe for inspiration. Here it is. The power, the energy, the sadness, the glory, the youthfulness of our land." In New York, Diego and Frida were living the high life. They were guests at a never-ending series of parties. They met powerful people from New York's world of art and finance, such as the business tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who subsequently became a patron of Rivera's. Frida wrote in a letter, "High society turns me off, and I feel a bit of rage at all these rich guys, since I've seen thousands of people in the most terrible misery without anything to eat." Rivera's show at MoMA was a huge success, and it recorded the highest attendance to date. The New York Sun described Rivera as the most talked about man this side of the Atlantic. After his show at MoMA, Diego was invited to Detroit to paint a mural on the theme of American industry. Diego was very keen to take up this offer. He saw Detroit as the home of the American proletariat, and so naturally he wanted to paint a mural there. The agreement was signed off by the Detroit Arts Commission, which was headed by Edsel Ford, the only child of the American industrialist Henry Ford. Diego was offered $10,000 to paint a mural celebrating the American automobile industry, and more specifically, the Ford Motor Company. And in April 1932, Diego and Frida hopped on a train to Detroit. Once Frida arrived in Detroit, she started introducing herself to people as Carmen. This is because the rise of the Nazis had led to anti-German sentiment in the USA, and Frida was a German name. Just like in Detroit, Diego and Frida were being wooed by Detroit's high society. But Frida wasn't impressed. The wealthy Detroitians came across as snobbish, and Frida noticed that they looked strangely at her traditional Mexican costumes. When Frida learnt that Henry Ford was anti-Semitic, she decided to ask him over dinner if he was Jewish. Henry Ford was very offended. Later, she said she did it just to wind him up and to make Diego laugh. But Frida was very lonely in Detroit. She didn't have any friends around, and she didn't like the people she was surrounded by. During her stay in Detroit, Frida once again became pregnant. She'd always wanted children, so this was exciting news. But her body was still very fragile from the accident, and she was constantly sick. And she worried about the potential health complications of this pregnancy. But nonetheless, she wanted to have the baby. Unfortunately, Frida did have a miscarriage on the 4th of July 1932. And she subsequently spent 2 weeks in hospital. After this, Frida sunk into a deep depression, and less than a month after leaving the hospital, she painted Henry Ford Hospital. It's a pretty harrowing image, full of symbolism. Frida explained that the snail represented the slowness of the miscarriage. Shortly after painting Henry Ford Hospital, Frida painted Self-Portrait on the Borderlands of Mexico and the United States. I see this painting as a kind of comparison between the more mystical natural environment of Mexico and the industrial landscape of Detroit. Maybe this was Frida's way of expressing homesickness. Also interesting to note is that this is Frida's first painting that includes a sun and a moon, which were to become recurring themes in Frida's painting, and which represented the Aztec notion of the eternal war between light and dark. On the 3rd of September 1932, Frida received a telegram that her mother was very sick and perhaps dying, and the next day Frida took a train back to Mexico. A week after Frida arrived back in Mexico, her mother passed away. In October of that same year, when Frida was back in Detroit, she painted My Birth. I get the sense that this painting was Frida's way of processing the death of the person who had brought her into this world. The painting was inspired by an Aztec stone sculpture of a woman giving birth to a fully grown man. But it also features a picture of the Virgin Mary, so this painting explores both Frida's Aztec and her Catholic roots. By March of 1933, Diego had finished his mural in Detroit, and he'd accepted another commission to paint a mural on the Rockefeller Plaza in New York. The mural was located right opposite the main entrance to the Rockefeller Center, and let's just say the mural didn't go down very well. On the left side of the mural was the United States, with businessmen drinking, gambling and smoking. Unemployed protesters are being beaten up by the police, and at the top are some ghostly-looking soldiers in a horrific war. On the left side of the mural is a Marxist utopia, where workers and peasants are all working together in harmony to build a better world. Apparently it hadn't occurred to Nelson Rockefeller, one of the world's biggest capitalists, that hiring a communist to paint his wall may be a bad idea. The New York World Telegram ran with the headline, "Rivera paints scenes of communist activity," and John Rockefeller Jr. foots the bill. Just to the right of the painting was an anonymous Labour leader, and before the mural was complete, Diego painted a portrait of Lenin onto the Labour leader's face. Then, on the 4th of May, Nelson Rockefeller wrote to Diego, asking him to remove the portrait of Lenin. Diego said absolutely not, and he declared that to remove the painting of Lenin was to destroy the entire artwork. Then, on the 9th of May, the Rockefeller rental manager and 12 security guards approached Diego whilst he was working. They gave him a cheque with the full amount owed to him and told him he was fired, and asked him to leave the Rockefeller Center. The mural was covered up, and 9 months later the mural was chipped off the wall and thrown away. But in 1934, Diego repainted the mural in Mexico City. Chapter 4. Trotsky, Sex and Surrealism. When Diego and Frida returned to Mexico at the end of 1933, they moved into their new houses in San Angel. Diego claimed he wanted to live in 2 separate houses linked by a bridge because it felt bohemian, but I suspect he also chose this living arrangement because it allowed him to conduct his affairs discreetly. Frida was looking forward to being back in Mexico, but her hopes of a happy life were short-lived when she discovered that Diego was having an affair with her sister, Frida Kahlo. Diego had had affairs before, but this one felt like betrayal. In response, Frida cut off her hair, stopped wearing her traditional Tijuana dresses, and soon afterwards she painted a few small nips. In 1935, Frida abruptly decided to move out of the San Angel house, and she took her favourite monkey with her. Frida was very depressed for the next few years, and as a result she didn't paint much. But in 1937 she painted Memory the Heart. In this painting, we start to see Frida using physical wounds as an analogy for emotional pain. Perhaps their home in San Angel was a good analogy for their relationship, together but separate. Each one had the option of locking the door and keeping the other one out. The architecture lended itself to secrecy. Around this time, Frida started to indulge in her own extramarital affairs. And personally, I don't blame her. And Frida was having affairs with both men and women. Rivera didn't seem to mind when he learnt about Frida's affairs with women, but he went crazy when he heard about her affairs with men. When Diego found out Frida was sleeping with the artist Isamu Noguchi, he paid Isamu a visit, pulled out a gun and warned Isamu that next time he saw him, he would shoot him. Diego had recently expressed his sympathy with the Trotskyite movement, and when Trotsky needed asylum from the Soviet Union, Rivera himself delivered a petition to the Mexican president asking him to grant asylum to the Trotskys. Leon Trotsky and his wife arrived in Mexico on the 9th of January 1937, and at the invitation of Frida and Diego, the Trotskys moved in to the Casa Azul in Coyoacan, Frida's childhood home. Shortly after moving in, Trotsky and Frida had a brief affair. Rivera was blissfully unaware of this affair, but Natalia, Trotsky's wife, found out, and she was understandably very upset. Trotsky's political entourage also feared that if exposed, this could compromise the integrity of the Trotskyite movement. So the affair ended relatively quickly, but Frida and Leon Trotsky remained close friends. By 1937, Frida was starting to take her artistic career more seriously. During this period, she started to develop the persona we now associate with Frida Kahlo. The paintings of this period demonstrate a certain self-confidence, an interest in Mexico's history, and a closeness to nature and animals. In 1937, Frida painted My Nurse and I, in which she suckles on the breast of a native Mexican woman wearing a mask. The painting explores the link between herself and her Aztec heritage, but the painting is also composed in the style of a Madonna and Child. As usual, this painting contains references to Frida's Catholic and Aztec roots. In 1938, the American gallerist Julian Levy fell in love with Frida's paintings, and he offered her a solo show in his New York gallery. Frida accepted the offer, and in October 1938, she set sail to New York City. The exhibition was a big success, and it was attended by the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe, Andre Breton, and other big names from the New York art world. Frida pulled up to the opening in a traditional Mexican costume, which I'm sure looked amazing, and Frida chose to use her maiden name, i.e. Kahlo, rather than her husband's name, i.e. Rivera. She did this because she didn't want to ride off her husband's success. She wanted to be a respected artist in her own right. The success of Frida's New York show gained her the attention of the Surrealist movement, whose leader, Andre Breton, tried to claim that Frida was a Surrealist. Surrealism was very popular and trendy at the time, so Frida didn't exactly deny the claim that she was a Surrealist. But later, in the 1940s, when Frida got to know the Surrealists a bit better and Surrealism had fallen out of fashion, Frida stated categorically that she was not a Surrealist. Personally, I can understand why people saw Surrealism in Frida's work. There are a lot of magical and unreal elements to her paintings, but these are mostly informed by her interest in Aztec culture and mythology, rather than from the European Surrealist interest in dreams and the unconscious. I feel like after her New York exhibition, Frida was undeniably clouted, and the Surrealists were trying to be associated with Frida because they knew it would benefit them and their movement. Whilst in New York, Frida had an affair with the Hungarian-born photographer Nicholas Murray, and it was a deep one. They wrote love letters to each other, and in one such letter, Frida wrote, "Only Diego will be in my heart as closely as you." Lots of the most iconic photographs of Frida were taken by her lover, Nicholas Murray. After the success of her New York exhibition, Frida was invited to Paris by Andre Breton, the leader of the Surrealists, to have an exhibition. So in January 1939, Frida set sail to Paris. It was a weird time to travel to Europe. Hitler was in power and he was being appeased, and the Spanish Civil War was drawing to a close. Frida stayed with Andre Breton in his Paris apartment, but she was not happy there. She was shocked at how dirty and messy their home was. Also, Frida was annoyed because Andre Breton was supposed to collect Frida's paintings from French customs, but when Frida arrived in Paris, he still hadn't done it, and Frida had to collect the paintings herself. Then Frida became ill with something called colibacilly that you get from eating unwashed food. In a letter to her lover, Nicholas Murray, Frida Kahlo wrote, "I bet you my boots that in the Breton house is where I got the lousy colibacilly. You don't have any idea the dirt those people live in, the kind of food they eat." Eventually, Frida moved out of the Breton house and she moved in with Marcel Duchamp. And she said Marcel Duchamp is the only one among the rotten people who is a real guy. Whilst Frida was in Paris, Trotsky and Diego had a falling out. Diego declared himself no longer a Trotskyite, and Trotsky stated in a Mexican newspaper that he no longer felt any moral solidarity with Diego Rivera. In solidarity with her husband, Frida also denounced Trotsky, and the Trotskys moved out of the Casa Azul, Frida's childhood home. Frida's Paris show was called Mexique, and it wasn't exactly the one-woman show she'd been promised. Breton also included the work of photographer Manuel Alvarez Bravo, 18th and 19th century Mexican paintings, and some random pre-Columbian objects Breton had picked up during a recent trip to Mexico, which Frida referred to as junk. Frida felt left out during the exhibition opening. She didn't speak French, and later she reflected that the French were too nationalistic and that they didn't value female artists. Also, the exhibition didn't make any money, so Frida wasn't happy. On the plus side, Picasso, Juan Miro and Kandinsky did come to the exhibition opening, and they were all impressed with Frida's paintings. Also, the Louvre did purchase one of her paintings, making her the first Mexican artist to feature in their collection. In a letter to a friend, Frida wrote, "You don't have the slightest idea the kind of old cockroach that Breton and almost all the Surrealist group are." In 1938, when Frida was back in Mexico, she painted What the Water Gave Me. Because of her health problems, Frida spent a lot of time in the bath. I also love baths, and something I love about baths is you can just kind of let your mind wander. So I imagine that this is what Frida was doing here. This painting seems to explore Frida's subconscious. Perhaps this painting was influenced by her encounter with the Surrealists, even if she didn't like them very much. In 1940, Frida and Diego got a divorce, and no one's quite sure why. My guess is that Diego found out about Frida's affair with Nicholas Murray, but that's speculation. Whilst the divorce was taking place, Frida painted The Two Fridas. The Two Fridas is one of her more famous paintings. Frida sits next to herself. Both Fridas have their hearts exposed. The hearts are connected by an artery, which the Frida on the left-hand side has cut with scissors. I get the sense this painting is about her divorce, and the cutting of the artery is the symbolic severing of her connection to Diego. Perhaps by leaving Diego, she's leaving a part of herself behind, but that's just my interpretation. 1940 may have been a sad year for Frida, but she was killing it with the paintings. She also painted Self-Portrait 1940, which I would argue is her most famous self-portrait. Here we see the typical theme of her connection with animals and nature, but she also wears a necklace of thorns, with a dead hummingbird hanging off it. The necklace of thorns gives the portrait a bit of a Jesus vibe. Although Frida wasn't a Christian, we know she loved a bit of Christian iconography. Perhaps she was comparing her own suffering to the suffering of Jesus. In Mexico, hummingbirds represent luck in the world of love, so a dead hummingbird could represent the death of her relationship with Diego. The thing that gets to me about this painting is Frida's eyes. There is no hope in those eyes, just suffering and boredom. In 1940, Frida also painted The Dream, in which she sleeps in a bunk bed with a skeleton. Frida spent a lot of time bedridden due to her health. I interpret this painting as Frida's way of expressing the fragility of her life and her closeness to death. And I just want to talk about one more painting from 1940, Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair, which is a less famous painting, but one that I personally love. After her divorce, Frida cut off her hair as an act of vengeance against Diego. But I think she looks so cool in this painting. The slick back hair, the oversized suit is such a look, and people wonder why she's a queer icon. On the 24th of May, 1940, Trotsky survived an assassination attempt in which Stalin's agents machine-gunned into his bedroom. Trotsky was lucky to have survived. Because Trotsky and Rivera had ongoing beef, Rivera came under suspicion, and so Rivera immediately left Mexico and headed back to San Francisco, where he'd been offered another commission. 3 months later, Trotsky was assassinated. He was murdered with an ice pick. And Frida Kahlo was traumatized, not only because Trotsky, her friend, had been murdered, but because she knew the assassin who had attempted to make friends with her as a way of accessing Trotsky. Frida herself was now under suspicion, so in September of 1940, Frida flew to San Francisco to join Diego Rivera. They were both very paranoid about their safety, and Diego hired an armed guard to protect him whilst he painted. Whilst in San Francisco, the two acknowledged that they still loved each other and decided to get remarried. But this time, Frida had some terms and conditions. Firstly, Frida would remain financially independent, and she would pay for half of all the household expenses. And secondly, their marriage was going to be a dry marriage, if you know what I mean. After Diego's affair with Frida's sister, she just didn't want to be intimate with Diego in that way, even if she still loved him. And fair enough. In February of 1941, Trotsky's killer was captured, and he did not accuse Frida or Diego of being accomplices, so they were free to go back to Mexico. 1941 was a tough year for Frida and Diego. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, and as communists, this concerned them. Every day, they'd turn on the radio and they'd eagerly listen to updates from the Western Front. On top of that, in April of 1941, Frida's father passed away. Frida had always felt a close connection to her father. Growing up, he was the kinder, more gentle parent, and he had shared his love of photography with her. So Frida was devastated. Chapter 5. Fame and Suffering. Frida's career really took off in the 1940s. She gained patrons, commissions, and she won prizes. Her work was noticed by the art collector Peggy Guggenheim, who included her in a group show. Frida's paintings in the 1940s continued exploring the theme of nature and connection to the natural world. In 1943, she painted Roots and The Flower of Life. In 1945, she painted Magnolias, and in 1947, she painted Sun and Life. In the 1940s, the Mexican art scene was changing. Mural painting no longer held a monopoly over Mexican art, and canvas painting and surrealism were becoming more popular. A painter called Rufino Tamayo, who was once criticised for being too European in style, was now considered to be at the forefront of the Mexican avant-garde. This shift away from mural painting and towards easel painting may have taken place because more art galleries were popping up in Mexico, and galleries needed portable paintings for their exhibitions. This suited Frida since she'd been painting on canvas the whole time, but despite Frida's commercial success, finances were never stable, so she began teaching to supplement her income. In 1943, Frida was invited to become part of the teaching staff at La Esmeralda, Mexico City School for Painting and Sculpture. Students at La Esmeralda were very excited when they heard that Frida would be joining the teaching staff. Upon arrival, Frida declared to her new students, "I want you to know, dear children, that there does not exist in the world a single teacher who is capable of teaching art." Students at La Esmeralda agreed that Frida's teaching style was completely unprogrammatic. She didn't impose her ideas onto them, rather she let them develop in their own directions. One student said she did not even say half a word about how we should paint. After a few months, Frida found that the long commute between Coyoacán and La Esmeralda was negatively affecting her health, so she started inviting students to come and paint in her home. She had a lovely garden they could all paint in. Students would be very impressed when they'd rock up to her house and find big names such as Jacqueline Breton or Leonora Carrington just hanging out and chilling in her home. Frida also referred to her students as comrades and encouraged them to read Marxist literature, but in 1944, Frida had to reduce her teaching schedule due to poor health. Her pain in her spine and her foot were getting worse, and the doctor had prescribed a metal corset and complete rest. In 1945, the pain in her leg and her spine only got worse, and she was being given medication which caused constant headaches. Frida had a special contraption made which allowed her to paint whilst lying in bed, and in 1946 she painted The Wounded Deer, in which she superimposed her head onto a dying deer in a lifeless forest. To me, this painting expresses Frida's feeling of being injured and just waiting for death. Whilst in the hospital, Frida was force-fed fatty foods to accommodate her medication. In response to this, she painted Without Hope, which depicts this experience. In my opinion, this is one of the saddest and most disturbing images produced in art history. Also, once again notice the presence of the sun and the moon. In May of 1946, Frida was flown to New York for an operation on her spine, and she spent the next couple of months recovering. Unfortunately, the operation was not successful, and to make it worse, Frida did not follow doctor's orders to rest. Frida was once again bedridden and in chronic pain. To handle the pain, Frida was being given extremely large doses of morphine, and she was regularly hallucinating in the hospital. In 1946, Frida painted Tree of Hope. Once again, we see two Fridas, a sun and a moon, and the Mexican landscape. Frida on the left seems to be under anaesthetic. The scars from the operation are wide open. The other Frida is sat upright, in tears, holding a flag that says Arbol de la Esperanza, mantene firme, translated as Tree of Hope, keep firm. These were lines from a song that Frida liked. Frida described this painting to a friend as nothing but the result of the damned operation. Whilst Frida was going through all of this, Diego was busy having affairs. He would visit Frida sporadically, but Frida needed constant, reliable love and care, which Diego proved unable to provide. In 1948, she painted this self-portrait. It amazes me how much vulnerability she could pack into a painting. Obviously, I don't know what the exact cause of her tears are, but I imagine it has something to do with Diego's absence during her time of need. In 1949, Frida painted Diego and I, which clearly illustrates that she had Diego on her mind and that he was causing her sadness. Towards the end of Frida's life, her physical condition made affairs with men more difficult and painful, so she became more interested in affairs with women, and she often had affairs with the same women Diego was having affairs with. In 1949, Diego became obsessed with the Mexican actress Maria Felix, and he asked her to model for him. They began an affair and the Mexican press found out. There were rumours going round that Diego wanted to divorce Frida and marry Maria Felix. To make things more complicated, Frida was also having an affair with Maria Felix. Eventually, Diego Rivera did ask Maria Felix to marry him, and she said no. Maria Felix was also unhappy with Diego's painting of her, which she felt was too over-sexualized. She did not give Diego permission to use the painting in an upcoming exhibition. Diego took the L and returned to Frida with his tail between his legs. Frida felt hurt, and Diego and I was an expression of that pain. In 1949, Frida and Diego's relationship was a weird one. When Frida was healthy, she became almost like Diego's mother. She would feed him, bathe him, and just generally treat him like a baby. And in 1949, Frida painted The Love Embrace, the Earth, Mexico, Diego, me, and Senor Chotol. I must say this is one of my favourite paintings ever. Baby Diego is held by Frida, who in turn is held by the Mexican landscape, who in turn is being held by who I think is Chotol, the Aztec god of lightning, fire and death. Frida always wanted to have a baby, and in this painting, Diego becomes the baby she could never have. I love this painting just for its cosmicness and its strangeness. It's just such an incredible image. Frida often painted Diego with a third eye, which I'm guessing represents Diego's spiritual insight and significance. Personally, I think she's putting him on a pedestal here. Diego was kind of a jerk, and he hurt Frida so many times. Chapter 6. Frida's Final Years. In 1950, Frida was so sick she had to go to hospital in Mexico City, and she remained there for over a year. Some of Frida's toes were black on the end, and the doctors discovered that she had gangrene. The doctors told her her foot would have to be amputated, leaving only her heel. This would obviously be an extremely difficult thing to process. I would be terrified if the doctors were going to amputate my foot. But at least from the outside, Frida seemed to handle the situation fairly stoically. She spent a lot of time painting from the hospital bed. She was kind to the nurses and doctors, and she tipped them well. And she fantasized about taking a trip to Europe when she recovered. Unfortunately, this trip to Europe would never happen. Frida was also on heavy doses of a drug called Demerol, which may have helped keep her in high spirits. Frida said, "When I leave the hospital 3 months from now, there are 3 things I want to do. Paint, paint, paint." But when Frida did return from hospital, she was extremely ill and remained bedridden. To make things worse, on March 4th, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, passed away. I know Stalin doesn't have a good reputation here in the West, but Frida was a committed communist and she'd always wanted to meet Stalin, so his death upset her greatly. But Frida's poor health didn't stop her from painting. She began to paint smaller still lifes from her bed. In 1953, the photographer and gallerist Lola Alvarez Bravo decided to host a retrospective of Frida Kahlo's paintings in Mexico City. This would be Frida's first solo show in her home country. When the exhibition's opening night came around, Frida was in such poor health the doctors advised her not to go. However, Frida was defiant, and she was brought into her exhibition opening on a stretcher. At this point, Frida had gained icon status in Mexico, and the public were very excited to see her. The gallery owner, Lola Alvarez Bravo, said afterwards that she was worried the crowd might suffocate Frida. Due to popular demand, the gallery extended the show for a month. Then in August of 1953, the doctors told Frida that they would have to amputate her whole right leg. Although Frida was putting on a brave face, this, understandably, terrified her. The amputation of Frida's leg also shattered Frida's mental health. Frida usually loved visitors, but now she was turning them away, and she was taking more painkillers than ever. Frida said that she wanted to end her own life, but that Diego was the only thing stopping her. At first, Frida refused to wear her artificial leg, but after a few months, she could walk short distances with it, and eventually she started to paint again, which did improve her mental health. When she had an argument with her friend Dolores Del Rio, Frida joked that she would send Dolores her leg on a silver tray as an act of vengeance. During this time period, when Frida was unmedicated, she would have very aggressive mood swings. She'd yell abuse at people, and she even threw a water bottle at Diego, which I'm assuming was a glass water bottle because it was the 1950s, and I don't think plastic water bottles existed back then. Frida's dependency on drugs increased, and she could only get so much from the hospital, so she started relying on Diego to get her more drugs from alternative sources. Frida had painted nothing for almost a year when in 1954 she painted this still life, which would be Frida's last painting. And on the 2nd of July 1954, Frida disobeyed doctor's orders and left the house to participate in a communist march. Diego pushed Frida in a wheelchair through the streets of Mexico City. This would be the last time Frida was seen in public. Frida passed away on the 13th of July 1954. She was 47 years old. Although her death was recorded as a pulmonary embolism, many people speculate that Frida ended her own life or overdosed on drugs. The last words Frida wrote in her diary were, "I hope the exit is joyful and I hope never to come back." Frida received a public funeral in Mexico City and her casket was covered with a communist flag. A few years after her death, the Casa Azul, Frida's childhood home, was converted into the Frida Kahlo Museum, which is still popular to this day. Thank you so much for making it all the way through this video. Can you let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video by putting a monkey emoji in the comments? Let me know what you thought of this longer style of video. Would you like to see more longer videos, or do you prefer the shorter, like 15 to 20 minute videos? Because, you know, I could do either. That was a lot of work. I am going to take the month of August off. I'm going to be back in September with more videos. So yeah, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate you watching this video. Have a lovely summer, and yeah, thanks guys.